On a late autumn afternoon, the town of Salem lay still beneath a veil of silver mist. The harbor water was a sheet of gunmetal gray, dotted with the tall masts of merchant ships at rest. Cobbled streets, slick with damp, curved between dark wooden houses whose roofs seemed to dip toward one another, as if sharing old secrets. In a modest, gambrel-roofed house on Union Street, a small light flickered in an upstairs window. Inside, a boy sat alone, his leg bound in a splint, a book open on his lap. The world outside was quiet, muffled by the fog that rolled endlessly from the sea. This boy was Nathaniel Hawthorne, and the quiet isolation of this room would shape his entire inner life. The Hawthorne name carried a weight of history in Salem, a weight the boy felt even if he could not yet name it. His ancestor, William Hathorne, had been a stern magistrate who ordered the public whipping of a Quaker woman in the streets. His son, John Hathorne, served as one of the unyielding judges during the infamous Salem witch trials of 1692. Nathaniel would later trace their names in the old family Bible, imagining the cold Puritan gaze of his forefathers. The town itself seemed to hold a collective memory of those dark times, a quiet guilt embedded in the clapboard walls and the creaking wooden wharves. For a sensitive child like Nathaniel, the past was not a distant land. It was a presence that fell across the parlor floor at dusk. When Nathaniel was only 4 years old, his father, a sea captain, died far from home in the Dutch colony of Suriname. The news arrived on a bitter winter day. His mother, Elizabeth, withdrew into a long, silent grief. She took her meals alone in her room, her footsteps rarely heard in the hallways. The house on Union Street grew profoundly quiet, a place of shadows and softly closing doors. The boy, with his injured leg, spent months in bed, listening to the wind outside and the creaking of the old timbers. This early encounter with loss and solitude taught him to sit with silence, to find company not in people, but in the landscape of his own mind. The creak of a floorboard became a story. The pattern of rain on glass became a meditation. Confined to his small room, Nathaniel discovered the vast world inside books. He read John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress, drifting into dreams of the celestial city. He absorbed Shakespeare's tragedies, feeling the weight of guilt and ambition. But it was the local history, the tales of spectral evidence and hidden sin, that truly seized his imagination. He listened to the old women in Salem talk of the witch trials, their voices dropping to whispers. In his mind's eye, he saw the gloomy prison door, the wild rose bush beside it, and a woman standing on the scaffold with a strange, embroidered letter upon her chest. These images were like seeds planted in the dark soil of his boyhood, not yet ready to sprout, but already alive with a quiet, subterranean energy. When his leg healed, Nathaniel began to explore Salem on foot, but he remained a solitary wanderer. He would walk the length of Derby Street, past the ship chandlers and the taverns, down to the long wharf where the Atlantic breeze carried a sharp taste of salt. He often walked alone at dusk, his figure a slim shadow passing the ancient, many-gabled houses. The low sun would catch the diamond panes of a window, flashing a quick, warm light before fading to gray. He did not long for loud companionship. The cry of gulls and the gentle slap of water against wooden hulls were his music. These rambles were not just exercise, they were a form of absorption, a way of taking the texture of old Salem deep into his bones, the scent of the tide and the sight of peeling paint. In the garret chamber of the house, where dust motes danced in the afternoon sunbeams, Nathaniel began his first attempts at writing. He fashioned a small desk from a board, set it by the window, and filled cheap notebooks with imitations of the 18th century essayists. He wrote fables, character sketches, and dark little tales that he was too shy to show anyone. The room had a round, low door and a single window looking out over the rooftops, so the space felt like a nest. Indeed, he would later call this period his owl's nest existence, a time of secret flight through imagination while the world below assumed he was asleep. His sister Elizabeth, equally reclusive, read his pages and offered quiet encouragement, but beyond that door, Salem knew him only as the still, watchful son of the widow Hathorne. Life inside the Hawthorne house was a quiet ballet of separateness. His mother still dined alone. His sister Louisa moved through the halls like a gentle ghost. In this odd, suspended atmosphere, Nathaniel learned the delicate art of psychological observation. He studied the way a certain slant of light on the wallpaper could evoke melancholy, or how a closed door held more mystery than an open one. He realized that the human heart was a dark chamber, full of unspoken secrets, much like the old sea chests stored in the attic. This early domestic solitude was not sad to him. It was a warm, familiar quietude, a retreat from a world that seemed too loud and too bright. Here, in the dimness, he could think clearly, and the border between the real and the imaginary grew pleasantly thin. At night, when the candle was finally snuffed, Nathaniel would lie in bed and listen to the distant sound of the sea. It was a deep, rhythmic breathing, a lullaby that seemed to come from the very edge of the world. He imagined his lost father on the deck of a ship, sailing through the same dark water. Outside the window, the moon traced the gables with silver, and the weather vane on the old courthouse turned quietly in the wind. The boy made a silent promise to himself. He would become a writer. He would capture the beauty of this strange, muted world, the grace of shadows, and the weight of unspoken guilt. And so he drifted into sleep, cradled by the sea's breath, while the fog rolled through Salem's streets, erasing all the edges of the day, leaving only a peaceful, dreamlike blur. In the years that followed, the boy became a young man, but the essential quiet of his life remained unchanged. After graduating from Bowdoin College in rural Maine, where he met future poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and future President Franklin Pierce, Nathaniel returned to Salem. Instead of seeking a profession in law or medicine, he climbed the narrow stairs to his garret and sat down at his writing desk. The door closed softly. For the next 12 years, a period he would later call his 12 dark years, he lived as a ghost within the town. He took long, solitary walks at twilight, he read voraciously, and he honed his prose in the gentle silence of his room. The room itself became a character in his life. It was a small, low-ceilinged chamber under the eaves, where the summer heat gathered like a warm, heavy blanket and the winter cold crept through the cracks. On the walls, he pinned up a few cheap prints, a view of Lake Como, a portrait of a hero from a Gothic novel. His desk faced the window, but he often wrote in the dimmest light, as if darkness itself was a kind of ink. The sound of a quill scratching across paper was the heartbeat of the house. He produced tale after tale, sketching the inner landscapes of Puritan New England, ministers with black veils, scientists with poisoned daughters, young men who discovered the terrible sins of their families. He published many of these early stories anonymously or under pseudonyms in gift books and magazines like The Token. The world beyond Salem scarcely knew he existed. He destroyed copies of his first novel, Fanshawe, feeling it did not meet his standard. Walking the streets of Salem, he was just a quiet gentleman whom merchants vaguely recognized. He would stop on the bridge and gaze into the dark water, watching the reflection of the clouds drift by. The slow, sleepy rhythm of the provincial town seeped into his sentences. He learned to value the weight of a pause, the meaning held in a single, carefully chosen description of light falling on a wooden floor. His sister Elizabeth, known in the family as Ebbe, remained his closest companion. She believed in his genius with a quiet, fierce certainty. In the evenings, they would sometimes sit together in the dim parlor, reading by the fire, saying very little but sharing an unspoken understanding. Their mother still kept to her own chamber. The house was a sanctuary of introversion. This cloistered life allowed Hawthorne to dive deep into the human soul without the distraction of social noise. He understood that sin and guilt were not just theological ideas, but psychological states, shadows that followed people through their daily lives, much as his own ancestral shadow followed him. His daily walks continued, rain or shine. He would pass by the old witch house on Essex Street, its dark timbers leaning at odd angles. He walked the grassy common where cattle grazed, the sound of their bells a gentle music. Often, he found his way to Gallows Hill, a quiet spot covered in wild grass and silence. He would stand there for a long while, thinking not of violence, but of the ordinary capacity for cruelty that lay in the hearts of respectable people. Then he would walk home, the sky turning apricot and lavender in the west, the first stars appearing over the harbor. These were not dramatic moments, they were meditative passages, moments in which the past and present merged into a single, serene melancholy. The garret was his true home. In a letter to Longfellow, he described himself as living in an owl's nest, a reference to the dim, sheltered space where he had made his perch. The nickname stuck. Alone in the owl's nest, he was not lonely. He was simply fully himself. There, he could hear the church bells tolling the hour, the distant cry of a fishmonger, the scuttle of mice in the walls. And in 1837, the world outside finally took notice. His collection Twice Told Tales was published, earning the friendship and public praise of Longfellow. Yet even success did not draw him out immediately. He peered from his window at the world of acclaim, like an owl blinking in daylight, and then he quietly returned to his desk. It was not through literature, but through love that he finally left his solitary tower. Through the Peabody sisters of Salem, he met Sophia Peabody, an artist and invalid whose spirit shone through her own years of seclusion. She had read his stories and saw the tender heart beneath the dark themes. Their first conversations were like slow dances, measured, deep, full of mutual wonder. Sitting in her parlor, Hawthorne discovered that a quiet shared with another person was infinitely richer than solitude. The light in the room seemed to change. The world outside the owl's nest began to feel less like a hostile glare and more like a gentle invitation. He was still a man of shadows, but he had found a hand reaching toward him, luminous and warm. Before leaving his nest for a new life, he spent one last winter in the garret, packing his papers, watching the snow fall on the peaked roof. The 12 dark years were over, but they had given him everything. They had taught him the music of silence, the architecture of guilt, and the deep, slow power of an inward-looking life. On a crisp January morning, he closed the low door behind him for the last time and walked down the narrow stairs into the bright, cold light of the street. The gulls were crying over the harbor, and the future, once a distant glimmer, now lay before him like a quiet road through an unexplored countryside. His solitary apprenticeship had ended. His life as a husband and a different kind of writer was about to begin. On a July afternoon in 1842, Nathaniel Hawthorne and Sophia Peabody were married in a small, quiet ceremony in Boston. They traveled not to a grand city, but to the countryside, to the village of Concord, Massachusetts. There, they rented an old, gray house called the Old Manse, set back from the road and overlooking the slow, winding Concord River. The house had been built by the grandfather of Ralph Waldo Emerson, and it was heavy with the scent of old wood and meadow grass. A great willow tree swept the lawn with its long, green fingers. In the garden, butterflies danced among the overgrown herbs. It was a place designed for dreaming, and the newlyweds sank into its peacefulness with a shared, grateful sigh. Their first months at the manse were a golden idyll. They would wake early and write in their journals, Sophia etching delicate pencil sketches, Nathaniel filling pages with observations of the natural world. In the afternoons, they walked hand in hand along the riverbank, watching the sunlight filter through the elm leaves, dappling the water with moving coins of light. They gathered water lilies and wild grapes. The outside world, with its political noise and commercial rush, seemed far away, muffled by the dense green curtain of summer. Hawthorne, who had spent years in dim rooms, discovered the joy of sunlight on a meadow, the buzzing contentment of bees, and the profound companionship of a mind that understood his own. The Concord River became his constant meditation. He would sit on the wooden bridge that led to the village, staring into the water's steady drift. In the river, he saw a symbol of time itself, always moving, always the same, carrying away old leaves and reflections. He began filling a notebook with descriptions of the natural world around him, a departure from his previous dark chambers. The book would later be published as Mosses from an Old Manse, a collection of tales and sketches that glowed with the gentle light of this pastoral retreat. Yet even here, his imagination could not rest entirely in the sun. In stories like The Birthmark and Rappaccini's Daughter, he still explored the shadow side of human striving, the danger of trying to perfect nature. Concord in the 1840s was the beating heart of American transcendentalism, a philosophy that saw the divine in nature and the goodness of the individual soul. Ralph Waldo Emerson was a frequent visitor to the manse. He would walk up the path with a slow, thoughtful stride, carrying a new book or a fresh idea. In the parlor, the two men would sit by the hearth, Emerson talking about Plato, Hawthorne listening with a quiet, sometimes skeptical smile. And there was Henry David Thoreau, a young man who had built a cabin by Walden Pond. Thoreau would glide up to the house in his flat-bottomed boat, silent as an Indian, and sit on the doorstep, talking of birds and trees. Hawthorne found them brilliant, but, in his deepest self, remained unconvinced of pure optimism. He still felt the weight of sin, the mark of the past. Hawthorne found a deep, wordless pleasure in physical work. He planted a vegetable garden behind the manse, hoeing the dark earth with his own hands. The feel of soil, the smell of turned earth and crushed mint, grounded him in a way that transcendentalist lectures could not. In the orchard, he would climb a ladder to pick apples, the autumn sun warm on his neck, the air tinged with the sweet tang of ripening fruit. Sophia would sometimes find him there, resting under a tree, his hat pulled over his eyes. These simple tasks, chopping wood, gathering pears, were a form of secular prayer, a release from the labyrinth of the mind. At sunset, they would sit on the wide front steps, watching the sky turn deep orange behind the black silhouettes of the pines. In the spring of 1844, a new sound entered the Old Manse, the cry of a newborn. Their daughter Una was born, delicate and bright. Sophia was radiant, and Hawthorne transformed into a tender, doting father. He would hold the infant in the crook of his arm and pace the floor of the study, murmuring nonsense poems. The house, once filled with the silence of two writers, now resonated with the small, sweet music of family life. He wrote less during this time, but his heart filled up. Watching Una sleep, he contemplated the strange, sacred bond between parent and child, a love so fierce and pure that it terrified him. It was another kind of mystery, this one bathed in light. After 3 years, the idyll at the Old Manse came to an end. Financial necessity forced the Hawthornes to leave their beloved gray house. On a misty morning, they loaded their belongings onto a cart and took one last walk to the river. The willow was dropping its yellow leaves upon the surface, each one floating like a tiny golden boat. Sophia wept softly. Hawthorne stood very still, his gaze sweeping the meadow, the bridge, the wide, patient river. He had been happy here, truly happy. The manse had taught him that beauty need not be tragic, that light could coexist with shadow. He carried this knowledge inside him as they rode away, the house fading behind the trees, becoming a cherished memory in the glass globe of his mind. Their next destination was Salem, the town of his birth and his ancestral shadows. The move felt like a return to a necessary darkness. But he was no longer a solitary ghost. He was a husband and father. He took a job at the Salem Custom House, stepping out of the garden and into the world of commerce and politics. The work was mundane, measuring salt and supervising tide waiters, but it gave him financial stability and, crucially, a view of the human comedy. The years at the Old Manse had rested his soul. Now, the dormant seeds of the witch trials, the shame of his forefathers, and the question of public versus private guilt began to stir. In the dull routine of the Custom House, the spark of a masterpiece was igniting. The Salem Custom House stood at the water's edge, a handsome brick building with a portico and a wide, sunny platform. Inside, it smelled of old tobacco, damp wool, and the salty breath of the sea. Hawthorne entered its doors in 1846 as surveyor of the port, a political appointment secured by his Bowdoin friends. Each day, he settled into a routine of quiet monotony, weighing merchant cargo, documenting ships, and exchanging slow, predictable jokes with the elderly customs officers. The windows of his office looked out over the wharves, and he would often pause to watch the gulls wheel over the tidal flats. The job required little creative thought, and that was its strange gift. It gave his imagination a fallow field in which to rest, while his unconscious mind began to work on something deeper. His colleagues at the custom house were relics of a bygone era, old sea dogs, a permanent inspector who had not read a book in years, and the ancient collector, a figure of kindly decay. Hawthorne observed them with a writer's eye, noting the way the afternoon sun fell across their dusty desks, the silver stubble on their chins, and the slow tick of the office clock. They were living reminders of time's passage, men who had once sailed the globe and now spent their days in a comfortable, fading routine. In these observations, he was already composing the famous introductory sketch for his next novel, a satirical and yet tender portrait of the custom house that would serve as a doorway into a darker tale. He was learning that the ordinary is the soil from which the extraordinary grows. In the summer of 1849, political winds shifted, and Hawthorne lost his position. The news struck him with a mix of anxiety and humiliation. He was, after all, a man with a family to support. The same week, his mother fell gravely ill. He sat by her bedside, watching her slip away, this woman who had lived for decades in a cocoon of sorrow. Her death opened a deep well of emotion in him. Loss, shame, a sense of ancestral burden, all the old ghosts gathered. It was a dark, cold period, and the only place for him to go was into the writing. His wife Sophia, with quiet wisdom, placed fresh paper on his desk, lit the lamp, and coaxed him to begin. The time for his masterpiece had come. He began writing the Scarlet Letter in the bare, third-floor room of their Mall Street house. It was winter. The wind rattled the windows, and the room was poorly heated, but he wrote with a steady, burning intensity. The story came out of him almost whole, as if he were simply copying an image he had seen in a dream. Hester Prynne, standing on the scaffold with her infant, the Scarlet Letter glowing on her breast. Arthur Dimmesdale, the pale pastor hiding a terrible secret. Roger Chillingworth, bent on a slow, cold revenge. The setting was the Boston of his Puritan ancestors, a world of gray severity and whispered judgment. Yet at the heart of the tale was a profound compassion, an understanding that love and sin, law and human need, are forever tangled. Hawthorne read the finished chapters aloud to Sophia in the evenings. The firelight flickered on the walls of their parlor. When he finished the final scene, the scaffold under a dark night sky, the meteor tracing an A of crimson light, Sophia was in tears. She told him it was a book of terrible beauty and that the world must see it. Her belief gave him courage. He understood that the novel's power came not from shocking events, but from the slow, relentless exploration of the human heart. Hester's punishment was public, but Dimmesdale's was a secret, festering guilt that consumed him from within. Hawthorne was writing about the universal condition. We all wear our scarlet letters, visible or invisible, and we all seek some form of release. The book was published in the spring of 1850. The first edition of 2,500 copies sold out in 10 days. Readers were stirred and troubled. Some found it immoral, others recognized it as the first great American psychological novel. In Salem, the townspeople whispered about the author who had laid bare the dark truths of their Puritan past. Hawthorne, suddenly famous, remained calm. He walked along the familiar wharves, now seen through the lens of literary success, but the sea and the sky were the same. The boy who had listened to the fog in his lonely bedroom had now spoken to the nation. Yet fame did not make him loud. He remained a quiet observer, a man more comfortable with a pen than with a podium. In the story, the Scarlet Letter was originally meant for adulteress, but over time, the town's perception shifted. Hester's needlework was so beautiful, her charity so quiet and enduring, that people began to see the letter as meaning able, even angel. This transformation was Hawthorne's central insight. Sin, acknowledged and borne with dignity, can transfigure a human being. Isolation and suffering can open a deeper well of sympathy. He did not write to condemn but to understand. His was a romanticism of the shadow, a belief that the path to wisdom often led through the dark woods of error. This complexity, this refusal to pronounce simple moral judgments, made the novel a timeless meditation on the human condition. With the success of the novel, the Hawthornes decided it was time to leave Salem for good. The town had given him his material, but it was also heavy with the dust of the custom house and the ghosts of the witch judges. In the summer of 1850, they packed up their home and moved westward to the Berkshire Hills. They would live in a little red farmhouse near Lenox, a place of wide skies and clean snow. As the carriage pulled away from Salem, Hawthorne looked back at the old, dark houses, the steeples, and the shining harbor. He knew he was leaving the source of his deepest art. But he also knew that the artist must keep moving, like the river he had watched for so many years, flowing quietly toward the ocean. The little red house sat on a hill above Stockbridge Bowl, a small, shimmering lake in the Berkshire Mountains. Its walls were painted a faded, rusty red, and it was surrounded by acres of meadow and deep woods. The house was modest, a low doorway, a few small rooms, a tall central chimney. The Hawthornes moved in during the late spring, when the apple orchard behind the house was a cloud of pink and white blossoms. The air was different here, crisp, clear, scented with pine and fresh earth. After the crush of Salem's history, this wide, open landscape felt like a balm. Nathaniel could stand on his porch and see for miles, rolling green hills, the distant blue line of mountains, and the still, reflective eye of the lake below. Their life in the Berkshires took on a slow, rural rhythm. In the mornings, Hawthorne would write in a small study that looked out toward the lake. The light here was gentle and diffused, filtered through the leaves of maple trees. Sophia painted and raised the children Una, Julian, and little Rose, who had been born in Lenox. In the afternoons, Hawthorne would take a long walk through the woods, his trousers brushing the ferns. He discovered the joy of sliding down snowy hills with his children in winter, his dark beard flecked with ice. The family would gather in the kitchen in the evenings, the fire casting a warm dome of light, the kettle humming on the stove. It was a simple, anchored existence. The most remarkable event of the Lenox years was his friendship with Herman Melville. Melville, a young writer who had tasted early success with sea adventures, had recently moved to a farm called Arrowhead, just 6 miles away. He had read Hawthorne's tales and felt an intellectual thunderbolt. In the summer of 1850, Melville burst into Hawthorne's life with the force of a charismatic storm. The two men would meet in the quiet of the little red house, or in the barn where they could talk freely. Melville was outgoing, passionate, wrestling with cosmic doubts. Hawthorne was quiet, reserved, holding his own dark skepticism with a gentle smile. They talked of Shakespeare, of good and evil, and of the blackness that Melville felt lay at the heart of the universe. Hawthorne invited Melville to stay for days. They would walk up Monument Mountain together, their conversation flowing ceaselessly as they climbed through the autumn trees. During a famous picnic on the mountain, a sudden storm forced them to shelter under a rocky ledge, and there, with lightning flashing over the valley, their talk grew deeper. Melville was writing Moby Dick during this time, and he later dedicated the massive novel to Hawthorne, in token of my admiration for his genius. Hawthorne's quiet, unwavering acceptance of the world's dark complexities gave Melville courage to plunge into his own abyss. For Hawthorne, the friendship was a warm fire, a recognition from a brilliant mind that his solitary thoughts were not madness, but a particular kind of truth. Stimulated, but also drained by the intensity of Melville's company, Hawthorne withdrew into a new novel. He wrote The House of the Seven Gables through the deep Berkshire winter of 1850–51. The book was a different creation from the Scarlet Letter, warmer, more domestic, yet still threaded with the theme of inherited sin. The old house in the story, with its hereditary curse and its hidden secrets, was a composite of all the Salem mansions he had known. But here, salvation came not through public confession alone, but through the simple love of ordinary life, the tending of a garden, the caring of a shop in the front room. He was writing about how the present can finally break free from the past, a theme dear to his own heart after leaving Salem. The seasons turned over the little red house. In autumn, the hills blazed with a glory of scarlet and gold. Hawthorne would sit on the porch and sketch the colors with words in his notebook. Winter brought a deep, silent snow that muffled every sound. He wrote by the fire, the lamplight steady and warm. Spring melted the ice on the lake, and the sound of breaking, shifting sheets of ice was like the slow music of a dream. Throughout it all, he was writing, living, watching his children grow. His health was generally good, and his spirit was calm. But the financial reality of a writer's life was always a shadow in the corner. The books were praised, but did not make him rich. The world of political appointments beckoned once more. His brief experience at the utopian community of Brook Farm years before became the seed for his satirical novel The Blithedale Romance, written during this period. He had gone to Brook Farm hoping to find a way to marry Sophia, and had found backbreaking labor and the same ordinary human frailties dressed in idealistic clothing. Now, from the calm distance of his red house, he looked back on that experiment with gentle, amused wisdom. The book was a quiet farewell to the idea that perfect communities can abolish human nature. True happiness, he implied, was found not in grand social schemes, but in the intimacy of a marriage, the loyalty of a friendship, and the private search for a home in one's own heart. By 1851, the allure of a steady income and the desire for a new horizon led Hawthorne to accept a position. His old friend Franklin Pierce was running for President of the United States, and Hawthorne agreed to write his campaign biography. When Pierce won, he appointed Hawthorne as the United States Consul in Liverpool, England. The offer meant leaving the little red house, the deep snows, and the friendship with Melville, who would feel the absence keenly. On a soft spring day, they closed the shutters of the red house and looked one last time at the beautiful, peaceful lake. They were sailing toward Europe, a new chapter across the sea. The Berkshires had given them peace, now the world called them outward, into an older history. The ship carried the Hawthorne family across the Atlantic to Liverpool, a bustling, smoky port city in the north of England. As the United States consul, Hawthorne's daily work was far from the meditative idyls of Concord. He was thrust into the grimy reality of docks, warehouses, and the endless complaints of American sailors who had been mistreated or robbed. His office, overlooking the crowded quays, was a front-row seat to human misery and the brutal side of commerce. Yet he performed his duties with a steady, sometimes weary compassion. In his journal, he recorded the faces of the poor, the ragged children, the old sea captains with their tales of disaster. The quiet dreamer of Salem was now a public servant, learning that the world's darkness was vaster than any Puritan allegory. When his consular duties allowed, Hawthorne escaped into the English countryside. He was drawn to the ancient, moss-covered things, the Roman walls in Chester, the calm cathedrals of Lichfield and Coventry, and the peaceful, green churchyards where sheep grazed among tilted gravestones. The soft, perpetual green of England, so different from the blazing autumns of New England, soothed his tired eyes. He walked the winding lanes, visited Shakespeare's birthplace in Stratford-upon-Avon, and felt a deep connection to the long, deep roots of English literature. It was as if he were stepping into the background of the books he had read as a lonely boy. He savored the quiet of an English pub, the gentle sound of rain on a thatched roof, the endless, melancholic beauty of twilight over the hedgerows. After 4 years in England, Hawthorne resigned his post and took his family south to Italy. They settled first in Rome, a city of golden light and ancient ruins. The eternal city overwhelmed his senses, the Colosseum at moonlight, the galleries filled with marble gods, the walls draped in bougainvillea. He was both enchanted and unsettled. The intensity of Catholic ritual, the weight of so much history, the naked, sun-drenched beauty of classical sculpture, it was a world away from the Puritan shadows of his imagination. He wandered through the Borghese gardens, watched the sunset turn the Roman fountains to liquid gold, and began to conceive a novel that would blend New England innocence with the old, dark genius of Europe. In the quiet of a rented villa near Florence, Hawthorne wrote his final completed novel, The Marble Faun. The story followed American artists in Rome, the pure Miriam, the sculptress Hilda, and the faun-like Donatello. It was a romance of the fall from innocence, a meditation on the necessity of sin for the deepening of the soul, a theme he had carried all his life. The gardens of the Villa Montato, where he wrote, were full of the scent of lemons and the sound of old bells. Here, he revisited his original questions. Can one be fully human without knowing guilt? Is the journey through darkness the only path to wisdom? His hair was now silver, his body more weary, but his prose still carried that gentle, probing light, illuminating the shadowy corners of the heart. In 1860, as the clouds of civil war gathered over America, the Hawthornes made their way home. They returned to Concord, not to the Old Manse, but to a comfortable house they purchased and named the Wayside, on the road to Lexington. It was a tall, wooden house with an ancient hill behind it. Hawthorne, now a tired traveler, tried to settle back into the rhythms of his old life. He built a little tower study at the top of the house, a new owl's nest overlooking the treetops, and climbed there each day to write. But his creative fires were burning low. He began 4 different romances and left them all unfinished. His body ached, his spirit was fatigued, and the news of the war, which would pit countrymen against countrymen, filled him with a deep, weary sorrow. In the spring of 1864, his old friend Franklin Pierce invited him on a journey through New Hampshire, hoping that travel would restore Hawthorne's failing health. The 2 men set out together, the ex-president and the tired author, driving in a carriage through the budding white birches and green valleys of the White Mountains. They stopped at small inns, took gentle walks, and talked quietly of old times. But Hawthorne's strength was gone. On the night of May 18th, at the Pemigewasset House in Plymouth, New Hampshire, Pierce went to check on him during the night. In the quiet, pre-dawn hours, Nathaniel Hawthorne had passed away in his sleep. There was no struggle, no dramatic final words, just a peaceful drifting from one dream into a deeper one. They brought his body back to Concord, to the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. On a gentle slope, under the shade of tall pines, they laid him to rest. The funeral was a gathering of the great minds of the age. Emerson was there, his own memory failing, but still standing. Longfellow came from Cambridge. Louisa May Alcott walked among the mourners. The sunshine fell in dappled patterns on the grass, and the scent of pine was heavy in the air. It was a perfect New England spring day, the kind Hawthorne had described so many times. The man who had spent his life exploring the shadows of the Puritan soul was now part of the quiet earth, his journey complete. And so the story settles like dust in an old library. The twilight descends over Concord, and the lights begin to twinkle in the windows of the Old Manse, still standing by the slow, dark river. A waxing moon rises over the custom house in Salem, its light touching the wharves where a young man once walked alone. The owl's nest is empty, but the pages he left behind are still warm with the breath of his quiet, probing voice. He taught us that a letter could be a brand and yet a bloom, that the road to the soul winds through sorrow and ends in a patient peace. Sleep comes to the village. In the dream, you might see him walking, a gentle shadow among shadows, heading toward the gleam of a distant sea. Let that image be the last. Good night.